Good afternoon. Welcome to EduSet Network. Friend, today we have another lecture on gender study. We would like to have a discussion on feminist theory and its approaches, the world over, how it's being practiced. And for discussion on this very topic, we have in the studio Dr. Aparajita Kashyap. She teaches law at a school for law and legal study in IP University. I hope her knowledge and experience will help us to understand this topic in a new perspective. So on your behalf, I welcome Dr. Kashyap for EduSet lecture. Welcome.
Yeah. A very good afternoon to all of you. We continuing with the topic of discussion today, gender issues. I'm taking up gender studies and mostly focusing on feminism. So when I begin the lecture, I start with differentiating between gender and sex. So what do we mean when we say gender, and what is it that when we say sex? Because gender is more than your physical makeup. So when we talk about sex, we talk about the biological makeup or physical construction of a person. And when we talk about gender, it is wider than sex, and it has four aspects. It refers to a personal identity, a social identity, a power relation, and a mobilized political identity. Now, with this background about sex and gender, now we only stick to talking about gender issues, because we are not only talking about a narrow restricted physical framework, but we are talking about a broader outline. And then while talking about this, what is the framework that we are going to keep while discussing? So we begin with defining what is feminism. Then we go on to looking at the demands of the feminist movement. What were the demands? Why did they arise? Then we are going to look into some of the important feminist movements that have taken place the world over. And then I would also be looking at the theories of feminism. And then after that, I would be concluding. Although conclusion is not possible, because there are so many things which are loose, which need to be addressed even now. So with this background, I just go on to defining feminism. What is feminism? This is also called women's liberation movement. In a broader sense, it's this. And it includes a campaign for women's rights and interests. And this was the concept which started after the first International Women's Conference, which was held in Paris in 1892. And the term feministe was used for the first time. And it was used to advocate equal rights for women. So basically, if we look at feminism, it is just talking about basic human rights. And it seeks this, the definition of feminism, if we analyze it, we are seeking equal political, social, sexual, intellectual and economic rights for women. Now, before we begin into the deep discussion, let us just look at the statistics about women and why they were ignored and what is their contribution. They possess about 1% of land in the world, which is very minuscule. So we can look at the status of their economic empowerment. Then if we look at the political achievements, we see that in almost 100 years, only 25 women have been elected as heads of state. Now if we look at the suffering aspect, then we see that the women comprise 80% of refugees around the world. And if we look at their economic and productive contribution, they produce between 80 to 95% of food in poor areas. So looking at the statistics, we can see that the women have contributed, but they have been denied the fruits of the contribution. Now, why did the feminist movement emerge at all? What led to the emergence? Because we had men and women existing ever since time immemorial. But what is it that made this consciousness come to the fore? So this started with the Enlightenment of Women, the era which we call Renaissance and Reformation in Europe. So related to this was the emergence of the Enlightenment of women, their empowerment, their awareness. Then they were given certain freedom to decide their careers and life partners. Although it was not happening throughout the world, but in certain countries, this was being allowed. Then liberal, egalitarian and reformist ideals that were coming up because of there were so many freedom movements all across the globe. Then there was decolonization, and this liberal, egalitarian and reformist ideals that started floating as a result of these national movements, they extended from the bourgeois, peasants and urban laborers. They moved on from not only talking about bourgeois issues or talking about the working class or the peasants, the agriculturists or the urban labor migrants, but we moved on and we started talking about the aspects of women. Now, when all this was happening, now we come to the modern era, and then the women started asserting, they wanted, demanding certain things. So what were the present day demands that we see for women? Now, they wanted a change in the stereotype role of women. The women were not what they were perceived as: bearer of children, looking after the family, and remaining confined to the four walls of their family. So this was not what we called women. So we wanted to make them economically and psychologically independent as well. It was not enough just to make them to have a changed role, but we had to make them psychologically independent. Then we have to broaden women's self-awareness and their opportunities, and this was possible by taking certain decisions, and one of this was the broadening of women's participation in the political decision making, because after all, everything tantamounts to coming down to the decision making, because when good decisions are making, when pro-women decisions are making, then definitely the advancement of women will come about. Now, if we look at the background, how it all started, if we look at, I'll be taking up a bit of a political perspective and then go into the economic perspective. So if we look at the political perspective, what was who were the political philosophers importantly talking about women? Now, if we go into the history of political philosophers, Socrates did talk about it, but the documented records say that Plato was the first feminist, and he even went on to say that women should be trained to rule in his book Republic. And he talked about an egalitarian society, and he said females should get the same kind of education as men, and they should be allowed to take up the best jobs. But he never talked about the rights of women. But I would like to emphasize here that he was not about rights for other people also. So this is a criticism which is labeled against him. But not only women, he did not talk about the political rights of other people as well. And then his disciple Aristotle comes in, and Aristotle, he was accused of being a misogynist by the feminist. He says women are less perfect, they are physically inferior and more jealous, they are less hopeful although very compassionate, and therefore their proper place is at home, and they have their own role, and it is too wide a role, and we do not want them to transgress the boundaries of home and come out. So they did not get the same education as men, and therefore he has been criticized by the feminists as being a misogynist. And then we come to the third important political philosopher of the medieval period, John Stuart Mill. He is the first proclaimed feminist. He believed that men are not intellectually above women. Women are superior in knowledge than men. And he always wondered if women were able to feel the same genuine unselfishness that men did in providing for their families. So as to say that we can just say with authenticity that Mill definitely was the first feminist. Now, if we continue with the philosophy and coming to the 19th century, in the mid 1800s, the term feminism was used to refer to the qualities of females. Not talking about their rights, but we were talking about their qualities. Now, after the first International Women's Conference, as I told you, it was the first time the term feministe is being used. And this is when the awareness about feminism starts in the true sense. And the term feminism in English is rooted in the mobilization for women's suffrage in Europe and US during that period. Now, a very important movement, the suffragette movement, which started in Europe, was only for seeking political rights for women. So women wanted voting rights, which they were denied, and a country like Switzerland, for example, as late as 1971, the women in Switzerland did not have their voting right. So the entire feminist movement that time in Europe was concentrated just about asking for political rights or maybe right to vote. So then amongst all this, because we had philosophers who were talking about feminism, and throughout the period then there were turmoil, there were feminist movements which were coming up. So I would like to trace the stages through which the feminist movement goes. So I would like to delineate the stages into three important periods. The first is the 19th and early 20th century, also called the early movements, but not recorded so much to be talking about. So they were just wanting certain empowerment and certain rights, and maybe then they were talking about equality in status. They wanted to have the same kind of education. So this was all. Now during the 19th century, there was certain movements, as I told you earlier, in Europe and United States to obtain women's suffrage. So 19th century, the full focus of the women movement was related to acquiring political power and acquiring the right to vote. And 20th century, right to vote still continues to be very important, but then the shift is that they are also asking for other things. They want political empowerment, they want economic rights, they want to be participating in all the social cultural activities. So 20th century, the movement really widens, but of course the most important power that they wanted was still the right to vote. Now if we look at the stages, the recent stages, the third stage, we look at the 1960s civil rights movement in United States. It provoked the women to agitate for better social conditions. So the civil rights movement, it was not only confined to asking for general issues, it was also a movement which sought better conditions, better rights, more empowerment for women. So the civil rights movement now almost kind of bifurcated, and there were demands which were general and there were demands which were particular for women. New types of jobs were created due to the growth of service sector, and this is very important because service sector is one sector where women are supposed to be performing better because it does not require too much of physical labor, and it requires a kind of finesse and minute detail working which only women are capable, which women are comfortably doing. So this creation, the industrialization had already begun in the 19th century. Then with the growth of the service sector, we had new industries coming up, we had the IT revolution. So all this required a large service sector, and then women now are shifting into the domains which were earlier occupied by men. So the domain of women is enlarging, and then suddenly amidst all this, then we had women oriented movements which were coming up, and there were leaders who were taking up the cause of women. For example, the National Organization for Women was set up in 1966 by Betty Friedman, and women's organization for equal rights were also being taken up. So there were formation of organizations, there were formation of institutions, so that there could be better formulated demands about women's rights. Now if we look at the 19th and 20th century, after the wave, the stages that I have quoted, there was also a wave kind of a movement which was occurring. So the thinkers have identified three waves in the women's movement occurring during the 19th and the 20th century. The first wave was a purely Western concept, and it started from the period mid-19th century until 1920, and the basic idea was to achieve basic political rights, or this was also called the suffragette struggle. And the basic civil and legal rights and rights to education were the three other demands. So apart from voting rights, they wanted civil rights, legal rights, including the right to education. Now the second wave, it waned between the two world wars, the first and the second, and to be revived in the late 1960s and the early 1980s. Political, social and economic rights to fight for greater equality came up. So they were not only now, because their domain was not confined to a household. So what they wanted was more rights in the newer fields that they had acquired and moved into. So they wanted more rights in education, in the workplace and at home. So things like rights of women at workplace, or because there were issues of sexual harassment being taken up. Then there were different wages for the same kind of work between men and women. So the women were asking for rights that would bring about their equality, so as to say. Now they wanted removal of gender inequality and oppression. In the general outset, they wanted removal of, because there were certain areas in which women could not take up a profession. There were certain areas which were exclusively male dominated. Then on the basis of gender, there was certain oppression taking place. So they, in general, the demand was removal of all this. And while all this was happening, there were other movements which were emerging, and we had the liberal movement, the radical movement and the socialist movement related to political and economic aspects, which were simultaneously going on in the world. And so the feminist movement did not run parallel, but it started getting integrated into some of these movements which were taking place simultaneously. Then we come to the third wave of feminist movement, which we can trace from the 1990s to the present. Now, differences even among women, so we say that we have acquired equal rights for women, we have acquired empowerment for women, but the important development here was that there were differences even among women. So we could not say that women were one group, because this group also had started seeing differences. So the difference was due to race, ethnicity, class, nationality and religion. So it was now even the feminist movement started getting subdivided into smaller groups because on the basis of these particular aspects. Now gender struggle was mainly due to search of identity. Where do I stand? Where do we stand in terms of our rights, our empowerment in this scheme of things, in this globalized world? Where do we stand? And more recent transformations of feminism was the ecofeminism, the concept of ecofeminism, which says that women are naturally more inclined to preserving the environment. So they should be given a greater role in environmental preservation or any aspect related to environment, and this is a concept which is called ecofeminism. Now when we talk about these waves, that there is the first wave, then the second wave, then the third wave, then a lot of people do not like this categorization. They say that all right, it is right to have delineated it into phases and waves, but the criticisms that are mainly raised are wave theory ignores the resistance between 1920s and 60s and throughout history over male domination. So it doesn't take into account all the resistance movements that had started. So they just ignore, and they only talk about they are asking for this, they are wanting this, but what about what they had done, how they had resisted? Now it also overlooks the resistance outside mainstream politics by women of color and working class. So these resistance movements are totally ignored, and it confines the struggle only to Europe and somewhat to USA. So it is not that these movements or waves were coming up only in Europe. They were not Europe centric. They were taking place also in Africa, Asia, but these parts of the world were totally ignored. So now to as feminism develops and evolves through the stages, then we had the emergence of feminist theories to explain how feminism is emerging, what is the motive behind the emergence of feminist movement, what is the pattern of their demand, and to explain all this, then we had the emergence of feminist theories. Now, the basic aim of all these theories is to understand the nature of inequality and focus on gender politics, power relations, and sexuality. All of these theories, if we see, they also focus on analyzing gender inequality and the promotion of women's rights, interests, and issues. The themes explored in all this is feminism. Then it is also against objectification of women in history and contemporary art, aesthetics, discrimination, stereotyping, and the set image that we have about women. So the feminist theories were taking up all these issues and trying to address these. So based on how they address the issues, what is the mode that they take, how they get integrated into the different movements throughout the world, we have the different types of theories, and based on these theories then we have the different types of feminism. So we have liberal theory, radical, cultural, socialist, Marxist, third world, post-colonial, postmodern, legal, and gender theories. And in the end, I will also like to talk about the feminist theory of justice, how they talk about justice as an aspect of feminism. Now, let's take up the first theory, which is about liberal feminism. I will not take up all the theories, but the important ones I am going to pick up. Liberal feminism: all rights are to be granted to women equally with men. So there should be no discrimination, no discrimination. And Cynthia Enloe, she goes on to say that their exclusion from the world politics was presumed a natural consequence of their biological or natural role. So she goes on to say that it was a presumption that biologically they are not fit to perform certain roles, and because of this they were excluded from certain domain, and that is why their rights in those particular domains were restricted. Now, the demand for liberal feminists was to end women's exclusion or underrepresentation in power and economic development. So, continuing with the liberal approach, then it defines feminism in terms of two claims. The first, I would like to show this. The first is the normative claim, which says men and women are entitled to equal rights and respects. This is the normative, what should be. And descriptive claim says that women are currently disadvantaged with respect to rights and respects compared with men. So based on these two aspects, then we had the emergence of the liberal approach, equal right for women, and that they should be respected equally. Then in this context, then we jump on to the next one, which is called the radical feminism. Radical, as the name suggests, are a bit of a they want quick result, and they are more vociferous in their demands. So radical feminists in Western society believe that it is patriarchy that oppresses women. So the root cause for all this difference is patriarchy. This is what they say. Early radical feminists posited that the root cause of all other inequalities is the oppression of women. So one, they say it is patriarchy. Then within the radical feminists, then the early group used to say that it is inequality and the oppression of women which is causing problems to the women. And the later radical feminists, they acknowledged effect of their other independent categories of oppression based on gender, identity, race, and social class, and there are the certain perceived notions also which they took into consideration. So they say that it is not only about oppression by men, it is also about other issues, the race identity, the social identity or class identity. So all this together, then they go on to lead on to the oppression that women are facing. Then the other theory about feminism is the cultural theory. So cultural theory, of course, takes into account the cultural aspects, and it says women are more nurturing and peaceful. Women's value systems are more important in politics and ecology, because they say that because they have different cultural values, so this kind of an outlook is very important when you're taking political decisions or you're taking up issues related to ecology. And this is why I brought in the concept of ecofeminism. And men must imbibe women's nurturing skills and values. So if they want to excel in politics and ecology in the field of environment, they must take up some of the skills of women. Now, another of the extreme movements, the socialist feminism. How do they these theorists define feminism? They say that class and gender are the same. They are units of exploitation. And Marx felt that when class oppression was overcome, the gender oppression would vanish automatically, because he felt class and gender are the units of suppression and oppression. Now, contributors to socialist feminism, they have criticized the traditional Marxist ideas for subsuming it under broad class oppression. They say class oppression is not the same as gender oppression. So, the traditional Marxists were criticized on this. And then there are two organizations which are important in the socialist feminist movement. One is the Radical Women Movement Party, and the other is the Freedom Socialist Party, that establish that class and gender are not the same. And then, as I earlier told you, the most important criticism was that why is it so much West-centric? Why is it all the feminist theory, why are they only happening in Europe, or why are they happening only in the third world? The developed world like US and Europe. So then there was, because there were also issues of feminism coming up in the third world. So because the more oppression were being noticed in the third world, and some of the women were getting enlightened and empowered, and then they would take up the movement and the causes of feminist movement in the third world. So some of the theories that were developed by feminists in the third world has this peculiarity. They were, most of them, the important point was most of them were Western educated, so they had a kind of a bias. So they acquired their views and took part in feminist politics in the so-called third world countries. Although women from the third world countries have been engaged in the feminist movement, they criticized the Western feminism on the ground that it is ethnocentric and does not take into account the unique experiences and contributions of the women from the third world countries. So this is very important. They say that this is very, very ethnocentric. They just ignore that women's movement were also coming up in the third world countries of Asia or Africa or Latin America. So this was an important criticism. Now, while all this was taking up, happening, it was not that it was localized. These movements would come up in one part, then they would attach themselves to other movements in other parts of the world, but on similar issues. So, and thanks to the internet revolution, there were also expansion and proliferation of the non-state actors like the NGOs. And most of the NGOs were taking up causes of women also, and then they were connecting on the World Wide Web. So what happened was that the feminist movements in different regions, different parts, they on similar issues, they started aligning, and the movement started becoming wider in perspective. And so much so that they started influencing international relations. And this is when I want to bring in international relations and feminism. How did the proliferation or magnification of the women's movement affect the international relations? Now, females influence international relations through the non-state channels. As I told you, non-state actors are any actor which is not a state. So this could include even liberation movements and non-governmental organizations, and sometimes terrorists are also considered part of the non-state channels. So as a result of this, the women's movement were, as I told you earlier, through NGOs and through the internet revolution, their aspects and demands were being spread worldwide. Now, in the international relations, there are different strands of thought which are based on their role in where do they stand in international relations. So there are different strands based on their role. One is the difference feminism, second is the liberal feminism, and third is the postmodern feminism. Now, as I told you, what is liberal feminism? Liberalism advises integration of women into the realm of foreign policy making because of their special abilities. Now, women have the same capacity as men, so inclusion of women has to be given a better chance because they improve the pool of diplomats, soldiers and politicians. Now, not only this, we cannot say that they are more peace loving. Traditionally they are more peace loving, they are more kind hearted, because if we look at some of the politicians, the female state leaders, they tend to be more war loving. For example, a few times that Britain has gone to war in the recent times has been under Margaret Thatcher, especially the Falkland War. Then Indira Gandhi's role in the Indo-Pak war cannot be, you can't ignore that aspect. So it's not that women are peace loving by nature, they are also war loving. This is the liberalist view. Now I will explain the different strands that I had taken up, like difference feminism, liberal feminism and postmodern feminism. So what is difference feminism? Difference feminism says that we must value the unique contribution of women as women. And gender differences are important, you cannot deny that, because it is biological and it is there and something you can't do away with. So it is important and it needs to be fixed. Okay, so because you cannot change the biology, but there are differences, and these differences, then you have to put a scale to the differences. Then essentialism is another approach which says core biological essence of being male or female must be the approach. That is, there is a biological essence, men have certain advantages, women have certain advantages. So this is due to certain biological factors and this must be preserved. The liberal feminism says, as we have already discussed, it says that men and women are equal, differences in ability are non-existent. So women have the same ability as men. So to say that women and men have different abilities is not right. And therefore, because of the similar kind of abilities that both have, we must include women outside their traditional gender role, so that they are not only confined to a domestic setup, but they have role outside their domestic setup. And then when we study women, we have to look at all the role that they take up, not only inside the domestic confines, but also outside. Now, looking at international relations, another perspective of international relations is war and diplomacy, and we cannot ignore that. So if we say that where do the gender issues stand in terms of war and peace, and when we generalize that, we say that war is quintessentially a male occupation, and the male aggression or the tendency to go into war is a behavior due to male sex hormone or the testosterone. Now, some of the thinkers also say that war is a way in which men try to fill a void which is there because of their inability to give birth. Now, and in this, all these aspects that I have taken up, it goes on to prove that men are more inclined to creating war and fighting war. But then the other 2 points are that women's unique contribution as peacemakers, they have always tried to pacify. Then they also tend to oppose war and find alternatives to violence in conflict resolution. So at the one hand, you have the group of men who are more inclined to take up war exercises, and then you have the role of women who are more inclined to not allow undertaking wars and go in for peace exercises. So if we talk about international relations, it's not only about war, politics, it is not only about war, it is not only about peace and diplomacy, it is also about economy. So the important aspect of international political economy, how does this aspect view women? Now in the international political economy, if we see the 1970s, women's NGO pointed out ways in which women were ignored. So as I told you, proliferation of NGO is the major contributor to feminism coming up. Now they say that there are ways in which they tend to ignore women, and we should not ignore women because all the development is a two-way relationship. Women affected by development, so what happens? They tend to lose access to resources, then they have to have additional work for them. And the other side of the arrow, the reciprocal relationship is that the outcome of development policies are also affected by gender relationships. So it's not only development which puts stress on gender issues, it is also gender issues which has an important role to play on the outcome of developmental policies. So all this was very important during the decade 1976 to 85, when we had the International Decade for Women. All this was highlighted, that is discrimination against women, then ignoring, not accounting women's contribution in the economy. So all these were the two aspects which were becoming very important. So what happened was, because of these demands, then we had the liberal approach which started integrating women more equally into development. So because of the demands in the international political economy arena that were coming up, then the liberal approach tried to integrate women into the development realms. There were other feminist approaches which were also coming up related to development, that development is damaging to women, therefore empowerment of women is essential. Now how do you measure development? How do you measure the index? What is the index of contribution of women? So there are two aspects here. One is the HDI. It measures life expectancy at birth, educational attainment and standard of living, whereas there is another index called Gender Developmental Index. It measures the same parameters as HDI, but there are adjustments in disparity between a man and a woman. So it takes into account the gender disparity while assessing the above birth, educational attainment and standard of living parameters. Now, so what did the women gain? How did they contribute to development because of all the hue and cry that we were raising? Now, this concept that has arisen due to feminist critique, development or proliferation of women's NGO and the decade for women. So these were the three important events which were taking place, and this led to the assertion of women's role in development. It includes different approaches to gender and development, and it also goes on to say that global economic crisis has effect on women because there are cutback on social service, there are removal of women supporting state provisions, then there is also an aspect of feminization of poverty. Then also the wage that you pay to women also goes down because employment of cheap marginalized women forced by the MNCs. The MNCs have this tendency because women are cheap and easily available workforce. So now to address all the aspects of women, as I told you, we had movements earlier and now we had the institutions coming up, political parties which were coming up. So some important organizations which had emerged in the world was the Women's Peace Party 1915. It is now called the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. Then we have another movement in the 1980s which came up to oppose the nuclear buildup, the Women's Action for Nuclear Disarmament. Then the 1995 Beijing Conference, which was sponsored by the UN, was very important because it was looking at the women's issues in terms of North-South inequality. So women of North were seen to be more developed and the women of South. So it was looking at the feminist issue from the North-South perspective. And while I'm doing all this, I would also, just as I told you, I would like to take up the feminist perspective on justice. What is the feminist perspective on justice? It says, it talks about feminist philosophy that is important because it says that the man's domination of women is a curse inflicted on her by a socially structured male society. So because we have had this structure for very long, so it is but natural for men to dominate, and while dominating, he is inflicting a curse on her. And the natural sex inequality, which we cannot avoid, is now turned and channeled to so that it becomes a social gender inequality. So what was a biological thing and which could have been ignored because it's just a physical difference has now been made a social gender inequality. And a woman is always considered below par. If you compare them with men, they are below par socially, physically and mentally. And her place is only within her home because she is ineligible for public life. So these are the presumptions on which the feminist theory of justice starts working. And now they go on to this group of theorists, they go on to say that rise and development of feminism has helped in bettering their conditions, and feminism is based on equality. So what they want is an equal egalitarian society. And what is a just society then? A moral and just society is where females should be able to explore their own potential. Let them be. They have certain instincts, they have certain potential. Give them certain advantages, give them certain handicaps, give them education, and because of their potential, they have certain inherent, innate capability, and they should be able to recognize that capability, and then they would take up their field of action related to that area. And what is justice then? How do you provide justice? They want to eliminate all forms of male domination. Then equality of rights is to be granted for both men and women. And the creation of society has to be based on non-patriarchal form. The traditional patriarchy format has to be given way to a more egalitarian societal makeup. In this aspect then, sometimes it is also brought by many of the things that many of the thinkers, that the subaltern perspective also talks about feminism, because the subaltern perspective means that there is a social pyramid and some people are higher in that pyramid and the others are lower in that pyramid. So the subaltern perspective says that they don't openly talk about women as being lower in the rank, but if you look at some of the aspects, then women can be placed into this subaltern perspective also. So they now demand justice. They also demand justice. So if we look at the role of women in that framework, then we are asking for two things. We are asking elimination of all types of discrimination, and then we are providing special, not only elimination is one step, then we have to make efforts to attain social equality. So just not doing away, but promoting equality is important. Now based on all this, then there are also, as I would like to bring in the totalitarian view on feminism, which I didn't include in the slides. The totalitarian view says that, for example, Hitler or Mussolini, they went on to say that women were inferior and their only role was to remain within the confines, and only their most important contribution was to bear children. And the more the number of children you had, the more you were contributing in terms of your value to the society. So value addition was based on how many children you bore. So this notion of discrimination of women has always been there. It has been there subtly, it has been there openly, and it is only in the later periods that we actually talk about emancipation of women and removal of gender bias and to some extent, of course, we have been able to take care of all these problems, but there are certain stumbling blocks which still remain. There are certain obstacles which we need to do away with, and I would like to conclude by saying some of the problems that still persist. They are still disadvantaged in large sections of the society. So there are so many parts of the world they are still disadvantaged. Then the value of democratic citizenship. We talk about value of democratic citizenship. Democratic citizenship means by the people, for the people, of the people, or everybody is entitled to vote, or everybody is entitled to select the leaders. But there are certain countries which do not give suffrage or the voting rights to women. So where is the concept of democracy then? Because you are trying to eliminate one section of the society. Then if we really want this kind of an egalitarian society, we have to do radical restructuring. And there are ways that have been provided because of the limitation of time. I cannot take up the methods or suggestions that have been given. Then we must increase the choices available to women, not confining their roles or confining their choices, because one important aspect of democracy, as we know, is availability of options and choices. So if we limit the options and choices of women, we are naturally trying to restrict their roles. So we have to increase the choices that are available to women. And if all this is taken into consideration, I think the feminist movement has a lot of aspirations and hope to look up. Thank you.
Okay, well, you talked about the feminist movement, but what in real sense it has changed the Indian scenario? Are you satisfied with it need to be taken up more on the real ground, not only talk?
Yeah, in the Indian context, if we see, India is more of a rural society, and our bias is that we are in a urban setup. So we tend to look only at the urban. We see that the number of women working in organizations have gone up. So we are very, very biased because we are only talking about a metro or a cosmos setup when we say that women are liberated and gender bias has disappeared. But it is not so. In rural India, it is still that women are subjugated. And it, as you said, it's only more about rhetoric, talking about issues, because of course we have policies. We also have tried protective discrimination through constitutional methods, but the implementation is a problem. So how to implement laws and policies related to women become a problem.
Okay. So, well, friends, this was really enlightening lecture on this feminist issue, feminist theory and approaches what being followed up. So, I hope this must have benefited all of you. I thank all of you for watching the lecture, and on your behalf, I thank Dr. Rajita Kashyap for giving such an enlightening lecture. Thank you very much.